Hello, in this video I want to start off the little final segment that we'll be doing for the Moten and intellectual property protection set of videos. I've really enjoyed doing these set of videos as a whole because I think that talking about how the kind of like literature base is that I've already kind of gone through in some other types of like context or that I've talked about really generally and applying them to the LD resolution is like really helpful not only for like my comprehension as someone that like coaches and teaches LDers, but also I think is helpful in terms of like relaying information of what I think are really like strong standards for how you can create information against various types of arguments. And I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that a lot of the arguments that Moten is making are really critical to the central questions that are being asked on intellectual property protections. And so I think that whether or not you're trying to read an argument from Moten and Harney or you're trying to answer an argument from Moten and Harney on this resolution, these videos can be extremely helpful and give you a lot of like feedback for what types of arguments you should be making. And this last two set of videos, I want to talk a little bit about how you should be answering Moten affirmatives on this resolution. And so a lot of the advice that I'm giving is contextualized to the last couple of videos that I did talking about Moten as an affirmative strategy on the intellectual property protections resolution for LD. And so I would definitely say go back and watch those last two if you haven't, to get a good idea of some of the stuff that I'm talking about and referring to when I'm specifically referring to Moten's critiques of the international and Moten's critiques of intellectual property protection as a whole. And I think that even looking at the intro to Moten and intellectual property protections can be really helpful to just give you overall context for what types of things you need to be looking out for before you even kind of like start this video and I start to think about like what I think are some like the main priorities of beating this type of argument. When I'm thinking about like what are the priorities that you really need when trying to answer this type of argument, I think that the first thing is that you really need to get the basis of like what level the affirmative like method works on. Is it an epistemological strategy? Is it a set of like praxis or tactics that we're supposed to put directly into place? Is the 1AC just a question of like how we study in the academy, or does it have like impacts on like institutions broader? And I think setting that bright line from the team or getting that bright line from the other team early on is extremely important to how you're able to like create your offense as you go on through the debate. So many times I feel like I've entered debates where I've been reading Moten or I've seen other teams read Moten, and before the team really asks any questions about like what is specifically supposed to be said or like what arguments or what type of methodology they're really forwarding from like Moten and Harney or Moten's like broad set of literature that he's written about, people don't really get an answer to that, and then they dive right in, and a team that hasn't made any arguments about the academy are seeing arguments from the other team that like are about like why Moten's critique of the academy is wrong and like why it can't get outside the academy when that's like nothing about what the other team has mentioned. And I feel like that doesn't actually do a justice to the types of like critical arguments or link arguments or even like alternative differentiations or whatever that you want to make when trying to really argue into Moten. And so just having clarity on like how the method works in your cross-check strategy and in the way that you're like jotting and flowing down arguments from the 1AC and using lines of the 1AC is critically important. Also because you're going to want to hold them to that kind of like bright line and standard throughout the rest of the debate. I think after that, the other thing that I think is critically important from thinking about Moten Harney as a strategy is getting a really good idea of like the way in which the judge is supposed to think about the question of like impact comparison. Do their impacts only work at the ethical level? Do they get access to questions of like climate change and other things because of like how Moten talks about how ecological crises are kind of paired with our kind of like social imperatives and various types of like social issues, and what does that really mean? And I think that that can allow you to just get the fundamental basis of like a lot of what the 1AC is trying to accomplish, at least at a method level, so that you can contest in a lot of other places, which I think is the biggest place where I feel like teams really miss the mark on terms of what arguments they're going to read. I think that when you kind of transition this into like what I think overall in terms of the case arguments that should be read against these types of affirmatives, I think the best case arguments are ones that are about why not just questions of fugitivity, but why the questions of like the social reorganization doesn't actually do anything to scale up to people thinking about like actual institutional organization differently. I definitely think there can be like a lack of orientation, especially on the side of teams that are really reading from Moten's literature base on like why their particular reorganization of how we think about each other socially actually transitions into people wanting to engage in institutional action, why it creates energy for such things, and why it doesn't create like all of these kind of smaller, more localized communities that can't really spill up, especially on the question of intellectual property protections, like in the LD resolution for these 2 months, like what that means at an international level and how it spills out broadly to places like outside of the US, how it spills out to places with completely different social and political contexts that don't really have the same type of relationship to slavery, to dispossession, etc. And I think that asking those critical questions can definitely force at least a more detailed explanation of like what types of arguments really hold up in terms of the organizational framework that these types of affirmatives want to take up. And I think that that's like really critically important for like the type of offense that you want to create. I definitely think that then when you kind of like transition this into some other case arguments, I think it's really important to forward on like early on that the idea that although there may be an existent like undercommons latent within every institution, the difference between that and the idea that those like undercommon kind of like relationships actually are like revolutionary action also is a separation that I feel like teams need to create, because then I think you have like a large push on like why, if they're kind of like making an epistemology based argument, why it may not spill out into the types of like action based like arguments or action based kind of like frameworks that they think it does, which I think is really critical to kind of like hedging back on their ability to weigh these types of like methodological weight on whatever other flow you're kind of like going for. I then think if you decide that you kind of want to go down the route of reading something more like framework and T, I always think the best route is to just build a question of like what kind of bright lines can be built when you're reading an interpretation like this. Like if you take Moten's ideas about study to like the way in which we should think about the resolution, how do we ever like build stable lines of like how the conversation is supposed to be had? Because if you're right that there are like these different interpretive communities, or that there are different ways that communities interact with power because of like this kind of like existent undercommons below these institutions, then it makes it like inevitably hard for us to section out like what types of interpretations are like necessary and should be kind of like engaged in debate and which are not. And if there is no like possible way that can be done, then I think that you have a lot more weight to be had against like pushing them to have to like be forced more down an impact turn debate between some of your more procedural arguments based in like limits, fairness, etc., and the way that kind of like has on things like education, etc. And I always think that in places like that, questions like predictability raise really interesting like kind of like internal links between the procedural weight and the kind of like more educational weight of like what we do in debate, because things like predictability are so interesting in terms of like their ties to both things, because things like predictability often define like how you are able to like have like a key apparatus of things that the negative is able to prepare for, which is necessary for the negative to have like fairness in terms of like what like prep distribution and things like that before you enter into a debate. But it's also a question of like how predictability and the limited basis of it allows more in-depth styles of preparation that ultimately make debates more educational, that ultimately can create better outputs of like what study is supposed to produce. And I think that those types of like sets of argumentation can really complicate a lot of the more comfortable ground that these teams are really trying to access in terms of really reaching the middle ground of like what this type of argumentation looks like. Hopefully this video is helpful, and hopefully you'll use it to engage these affirmatives if you see them on your resolution, or at least take notes for how they may be considered as you see Moten arguments come up more often in debate generally, or at least just take that second of time to create clarity for how you want to address these affirmatives, which is a really big point that I think you should see throughout this video. Thanks for always for tuning in, and can't wait to do this last video on this set of videos. Thanks.